He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. Welcome to Black Sheep. It's late April 1820. We're standing on the beach at Rangihaua in the Bay of Islands. A small missionary settlement is perched on the slopes above the beach, next to a Māori pā. It's the very first outpost of Christianity in New Zealand. A wooden wharf stretches out from the sand and into the water. A ship named the Dromedary is sitting at anchor. It's swarming with sailors unloading cargo. One man's carrying a large wooden cask. It's labelled Leathers and addressed to a man named Thomas Kendall. This sailor's making his way out across the deck when suddenly someone bumps into him. A few minutes later, a man runs into a house at Rangihaua and asks to speak with Reverend Samuel Marsden, assistant chaplain at the Church Missionary Society. The man speaks to Marsden in low tones. First, the Reverend turns white. Then, he turns red. Later, Samuel Marsden puts pen to paper. It's a letter to Thomas Kendall, a missionary who'd been working in New Zealand since 1814 and had recently left on a trip to England.
Dear Sir, as a vessel sails this morning for Port Jackson, I embrace the opportunity to write you a line.
Marsden starts with the weather, describing the heavy rain that greeted his arrival in Kirikiri.
The swamps and creeks were all full, and the streams very rapid and deep. I had to wade through them all, as the natives could not attempt to carry me.
Finally, he gets to the guts of his message. Marsden tells the story of the broken cask, the cask addressed to Thomas Kendall and labelled as containing leathers.
I was informed you had opened a cask on board the Dromedary directed to you, and that had been shipped by me, not knowing its contents, with 5 muskets in it. I could hardly believe the report, had not a gentleman told me who would not assert an untruth.
Marsden's careful cursive script betrays his fury.
I felt the keenest anguish when I learned these things. I am convinced such conduct will bring a curse upon New Zealand.
Marsden reminds Kendall of the sight which had greeted both of them around the time Kendall left the Bay of Islands for England a few months earlier.
You will remember about 40 canoes came into the harbour from a war expedition. I went on shore when the canoes were landed, and there beheld the most distressing scenes. The miserable captives of war embracing the heads of their departed fathers or chiefs, and cutting their own bodies after their manner, and mingling their blood with their tears. When I consider that the missionaries were furnishing the instruments of death to these poor savages by supplying them with muskets and powder, I could not but feel the greatest indignation at such a thought.
At the time Samuel Marsden was writing, Aotearoa, New Zealand, was in the middle of the bloodiest wars it had ever seen, or ever would see up until the modern day. The Musket Wars. The exact numbers are uncertain, but either directly or indirectly, it's estimated these conflicts killed about 20,000 Māori at a time when the entire population was only about 100,000. By contrast, about 18,000 New Zealanders died in the First World War, and our population then was over 1 million. One of the men most often associated with the musket trade in the 1810s and 20s is today's black sheep, Thomas Kendall. In 1968, one of New Zealand's top historians, the late Dame Judith Binney, published a biography of Thomas Kendall. Its title is The Legacy of Guilt.
It is extremely dense reading.
This is Peter Lynham. He's Professor Emeritus of Religious History at Massey University. And there's a lot of characters and a lot of...
Which I revel in, you understand.
Yeah, I know. But it's just... and the relationship between them is just...
It's complex.
It's very complex,
and
yeah.
very, very fraught.
Yeah. Part of the reason Dame Judith's biography is so dense and fraught is the missionaries involved in this early settlement at Rangihoua, including Thomas Kendall, wrote a lot of very long letters. And these letters paint a picture of complete and utter chaos, feuding, jealousy, infidelity, and, of course, arms dealing.
It's difficult not to spend time imagining the world of this tiny little group of Europeans in a world of Māori fighting endlessly with one another. It's
extremely catty sometimes.
Oh, it's very, very vicious. It's very, very vicious.
So far, we're not painting a very pretty picture of Thomas Kendall. He's an arms-dealing missionary with acid dripping from his pen. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he also had an affair with a young Māori woman and almost got murdered by her fiancé. But there is another side to Thomas Kendall's story.
He was very popular amongst our people, and he was spoken fondly of. He wasn't popular for taking somebody's fiancé, but for the rest of his life, he was popular, and I think so was his family, so was his wife, Jane.
This is Hami Piripi. He's a kaumātua of Te Reo and a former chair of the Māori Language Commission. His whakapapa links him to some of the key figures in this story, including Kendall's most important ally, the Ngāpuhi rangatira Hongi Hika.
He really was a true believer in our view of our explanation of the universe. And I think he probably stayed that way until he died. The way that he was treated by his peers, they shunned him and they rejected him and they drove him out and his family. Nothing ceases to amaze me about the complexity of European hypocrisy.
So, across the next 2 episodes of Black Sheep, we'll be looking at the complexity and the hypocrisy of Thomas Kendall. Well, look, shall we crack into it?
Sure.
So, Thomas Kendall, he is from a sort of small farm-holding family?
That's right. So he is not by any means gentry, though in New Zealand he behaves as though he were gentry, and that's quite a striking aspect of the story, I think.
Thomas Kendall was born in Lincolnshire in 1778. He was the 5th of 7 children. He must have enjoyed school because Kendall's first job was as an assistant school teacher. In 1803, he married another teacher, Jane Quickfall, and the couple would eventually have 9 children. After getting married, Thomas tried to switch careers from teacher to merchant. In November 1805, he travelled to London, selling a cartload of hops. But as he was driving his cart through Marylebone, he heard a choir singing from a nearby Calvinist chapel. Later that evening, he went back to sit in the chapel and listened to the sermon of Reverend Basil Wood. It was about the fate of people living beyond the Christian world, people described in the language of the day as heathens. We don't know exactly what Reverend Wood said, but it hit Thomas Kendall like a ton of bricks. He wrote about the sermon in a letter to Reverend Wood years later when he was on his way to New Zealand, reflecting on this pivotal moment in his life.
It was a call upon me to reflect, and I do account it one of the greatest mercies that I have received from a merciful Saviour. I pray that I may henceforth be employed in promoting the real good of my fellow creatures, and to use my feeble efforts in publishing to the heathen world the honour of Jesus' name and the blessings of his salvation.
An extraordinary epiphany, which is almost the classic evangelical conversion, the sense of his own sinfulness, the sense of his complete salvation solely through the grace of God, that he was not worthy of it, but that Christ, his Saviour, had reconciled him and his sin and brought him into close relationship with his Maker. And I think that kind of deep conviction stuck with him more or less throughout his entire life from then on.
I left my hops unsold. I returned home upon the Monday following and sold my little property. I came to town in January and fixed my residence near to those means of grace, which I trusted would lead me to the hope of glory.
Thomas Kendall became a devoted Calvinist. I'm not going to get drawn into the details of Calvinism because that story goes back hundreds of years and Kendall's story is complicated enough as it is. What's essential to know for Kendall's story is that Calvinism was a source of self-worth and motivation for him, but also a source of deep anxiety.
The reformed position that followed John Calvin from Geneva back in the 16th century held that there was nothing that humans could do to save themselves, that they were entirely thrown on the grace of God, that their actions, even their good actions, could be attributed to God and not to themselves.
And this, in Kendall at least, seems to lead to a lot of self-doubt and self-recrimination. He's very hard on himself all through his life.
Because the classic problem for the evangelicals, this is a great claim to say that I have been saved by the grace of God. I am predestined to be in God's eternal purpose. But it gives no guaranteed way by which you can know that you are this person. And so if anything comes up in your life that throws doubt on this, you've got very little to fall back on to defend yourself.
Thomas Kendall wanted to prove he was worthy of salvation. And the best way to do this, he thought, was by becoming a missionary.
I could not but be seriously affected with the distressing accounts which I continually heard respecting the deplorable state of the heathen world. That the soul of a poor heathen was as valuable as my own I could not doubt, nor that Christ was as ready to save him.
Kendall joined the Church Missionary Society, and at around the same time, in the early 1810s, the Society was thinking about establishing a new mission on the other side of the world.
New Zealand comes to their attention because Samuel Marsden, chaplain in the Sydney, he's met Māori who've come across the Tasman, and he thinks that they are ideal candidates just waiting to be converted. He sells to the Church Missionary Society, here is a field for your endeavours, and then they have to find missionaries to achieve it.
And I think there's maybe a bit of a cynical attitude towards missionaries these days, but they are very genuine in their belief that they're doing, the best possible thing by sort of giving everything up to preach the gospel.
Well, more than that, given that there is, in effect, no support whatsoever financially that's being offered, there are, no ready communications. It's an astonishingly self-denying act. And one indication of the problems that they had of doing this is that no clergy come forward to volunteer to do this task. They are much more aware that they need money and support, and they prefer to stay in England. So the mission comes to rely on ordinary lay people who have this vision for the task.
So, in 1813, Thomas and Jane Kendall and their 5 kids landed at Port Jackson, that's modern Sydney. They met the other visionary lay people who were going with them to New Zealand as missionaries, William Hall, a carpenter, and John King, a shoemaker.
They're people from primitive, simple backgrounds, but also profoundly converted, deeply convinced that God has called them to this task.
The trio were described in the language of the day as spiritual mechanics. And that doesn't have anything to do with car mechanics, just by the way. Cars obviously hadn't been invented. Mechanics back in the day just used to be a word for anyone with a kind of technical skill. And the plan was that Kendall, Hall and King would impress Māori with these technological skills and teach them to read and write and sort of gently encourage them to become Christians.
That's part of the logic, but the other part of the logic is very important, and this is the idea that Samuel Marsden had, an idea of civilization, that the Europeans are civilized, that the rest of the world should be compared to infants. They're not fully grown up. They've got a long way for maturity to reach them. And so the only possibility to get to such high ideals as Christian faith, which is seen as the peak of civilization, must be to actually raise them up and civilize them. And so therefore it's not such a bad idea to use mechanics, because if you can teach them elementary crafts, you can raise them to be useful in a civilized world and to speed up their civilization, so at length they will be converted.
So it is definitely an element of ethnocentrism in it, but more than that was the piousness of their religious beliefs. And I can't believe how puritanical it must have been.
It took longer than expected before the mission to New Zealand finally got underway, largely because they couldn't find a ship to take them. Back in 1807, back when Kendall was first just joining the Church Missionary Society, there was an incident known as the Boyd Massacre. Long story short, the crew aboard a whaling ship called the Boyd badly mistreated the son of a Ngāti Po rangatira who was sailing with them. When the ship landed at Whangaroa, this guy's relatives boarded the ship, took extreme exception to his mistreatment, and killed about 70 people. According to survivors, many of those people were later eaten. Then, Māori accidentally ignited the ship's store of gunpowder and whale oil, and the Boyd and everyone on it was blown to bits. A small fleet of other whaling ships responded by attacking a pa which didn't even belong to the people who attacked the Boyd and burning that to the ground. And in the aftermath of all this, ship captains were extremely wary of sailing to New Zealand.
So there's a long delay in Sydney where they spend time at, Marsden has set up at Parramatta, a school for Māori. So it's possible for these young missionary cadets to go and live with Māori people. And so there's quite a conversing with the culture.
Over time, anxieties eased, and the hunger for Māori trade goods drew European ships back to New Zealand shores. Writing in 1817, Thomas Kendall reflected on his very first voyage to Aotearoa in March 1814, when he and Marsden were scouting the settlement site at Rangihoa aboard a ship called the Active.
When I first saw the New Zealanders, their wild, forlorn looks and demeanour were distressing to my feelings. I conceived they must indeed be sunk to the lowest pitch of human degradation, and greatly doubted the possibility that a person or family would be permitted to live among them for any reasonable time in safety.
However, Kendall says he was quickly won over by the warm hospitality and the intelligence of the people he met.
The very kind manner in which they treated me and conveyed me back to the Active encouraged me to repose in them still greater confidence and to return with my family.
On his voyage back to Sydney on the Active, Kendall actually got into a violent argument with the ship's captain, who refused to treat Māori passengers as equals. This fight apparently got so heated the captain threatened to shoot Kendall, and in the aftermath Kendall wrote disgustedly that,
"On the active which was sent out expressly for the purpose of bearing tidings of goodwill, the New Zealanders have been taught to feel their inferiority."
Kendall wasn't a man without prejudices. You often read him saying some pretty unpleasant stuff, like he dismisses Māori spirituality as
deplorably corrupt,
and their way of life as
a horrid state of barbarity.
Thomas Kendall was, after all, a missionary, and among his foundational beliefs was that Māori weren't just technologically primitive, as he would have said, but also under the influence of Satan. As he wrote in that 1817 letter,
"Civilized Christian assembly could not bear to hear a variety of cases which might be recited to show in what a sad state of captivity the great deceiver of mankind holds these poor people. In general, it may be said of them, as of all the heathens, that they are perishing for lack of knowledge, and that gross darkness covers their minds."
But Kendall wasn't like an old Roman missionary, going out to pagan settlements, burning carvings, desecrating sacred sites. Instead, as Hami Piripi says, Kendall tried to bridge the gap between Māori spirituality and his own Christian understanding of the world.
He was adopting their perspective on the universe, for want of a better word, and not even in a challenging way to the theology. In fact, he was trying to weld together their theologies to make it work. But he didn't see them as being the antithesis of each other, which perhaps was his undoing in the end.
We'll get back to that story in our next episode, but for now, let's wind back to December 1814. Thomas Kendall, William Hall and John King all land together at Rangihoua. They had dreams of establishing a sort of utopian society, planting crops, building houses, educating the natives, sharing everything communally. And if that all sounds too good to be true, it was.
Because you need the nuts and bolts to stitch it all together to make it the mechanism to bring about the equity, or the balance, rather. That's what Māori tikanga brings to communal living and makes it viable.
The first problem was that the steep south-facing land at Rangihoua wasn't good for farming. But Samuel Marsden refused to move the mission to a better location or to provide the missionaries with adequate supplies.
They virtually had to bring everything from Sydney. Marsden was a very mean person with money, very reluctant to provide them with any credit. This is a great difficulty for the missionaries. They have to build houses for themselves, they have to negotiate land, and in all of this, any sense of missionary calling is almost completely lost, especially once they start falling out with one another.
And that happens almost immediately, right?
Well, really, it's happened before they've even left for New Zealand. You imagine three people with a strong sense of individual calling, with a passionate sense of their own purpose, and also a whole lot of other. We often forget that there were a number of assistants who came along to help build the houses and were not given to any high evangelical ideals.
These assistants, by the way, were often convict labourers.
So there's all the tensions of a tiny, tiny little community, which isn't a community, where people each have their own vision of how they will achieve the goal. And unfortunately, Kendall is given the authority from the Governor of New South Wales to be, in some sense, a magistrate or a justice of the peace in New Zealand, because the governor is very concerned about reports of misbehaviour from the sealers and whalers in New Zealand. This gives Kendall a reason to think that he is the most important, and so there's bitter reaction to this from King and from Hall.
So these three missionaries, King, Hall and Kendall, are all squabbling among themselves. And then there's Marsden off in Australia, and he's just making everything way, way worse.
As far as Marsden was concerned, these were all underlings and had no right to have any opinions of their own. And so that very strong interference is a big factor in what happens. And I think then Kendall's own character, his prickliness, his defensiveness, his desire that he is the gentleman, that he is the person who has the superior culture to all the others.
So in this first year at Rangihoua, and honestly for most of the years that followed, nothing went to plan. And that included Kendall's efforts to open a school for Māori in 1816.
It lasts, I think, for a month. The kids have no interest in attending. Why would they? I mean, what would persuade people to want to come to learn how to write the Māori language, which almost by definition was itself a spoken language?
Māori attitudes towards literacy would change radically in the future, but at this stage, the gloss had well and truly worn off the missionaries from the Māori perspective.
In the end, it's hard to think that for Māori, the Europeans were very important at all. These, pompous little missionaries had very little sense of significance for Māori who looked on at them, and their barbarous attempts to speak the Māori language and their ridiculous attempts to create schools all was, I think, treated as little more than a joke for a few days.
The position of the missionaries at Rangihoua was tenuous from the very beginning. And just months after their arrival in Aotearoa, they lost their most powerful advocate. Ruatara. Samuel Marsden had met Ruatara on a ship from London to Sydney in 1809. At the time he met Marsden, the 22-year-old Ngāpuhi rangatira was sick, hungry and injured. He'd been beaten so badly by a group of sailors that he was vomiting blood. On arrival in Australia, Samuel Marsden took Ruatara to his house in Parramatta, and over the next 8 months or so, they struck up a firm friendship. Ruatara was pretty ambivalent about Christianity, but he was very enthusiastic about European agricultural technology. He wanted to grow wheat and bake bread to feed his people, and to trade wheat for iron tools and nails to build European-style ships. In exchange for access to this technology, Ruatara agreed to support the missionaries in Rangihoua.
In those days, of course, having your own Pākehā was a very desirable thing. Made them keen, I think, to gather as many as they could, and particularly those who were sympathetic. In Kendall's case, he is probably the most so sympathetic, he just about became one of us.
But then, in February 1815, Ruatara got sick. The missionaries, including Thomas Kendall, attempted to treat Ruatara in spite of strong objections from his people that he must be isolated. Samuel Marsden actually only got permission to enter Ruatara's whare after threatening to bombard the kāinga with cannon fire. It was all in vain. On March 2nd, 1815, Ruatara died.
The search for an alternative patron becomes very critical for the survival of the mission because it's sitting on the fringe of Māori society. I mean, it can be tossed out at any moment. So they need a great chief who will support them. And in Hongihika, they find such a person.
Hongihika was Ruatara's uncle. We've spoken about him in a previous episode of Black Sheep because he also played a central role in the escalation of the Musket Wars. After his nephew's death, Hongi agrees to take over as the protector of the missionaries.
Hongihika sees and uses such opportunities very cleverly for his own purposes, and he plays the missionaries as pawns in his complex games which he's working on, trying to dominate the whole of the Bay of Islands.
And this is particularly with the missionaries getting access to metal tools which can also be used as weapons and eventually muskets.
Oh, and this was the critical issue, that the only way that they could actually win any respect or be appreciated by Māori was by providing Māori with something that in the conflicted world of the Bay of Islands gave them an advantage over their enemies. And Hongi Hika is quick to realise that tools have got some advantages as weapons, and the musket is what he comes to long for.
Thomas Kendall was a critical player in the missionaries' alliance with Hongi Hika and in the trade for muskets. In no small part, that's because of Kendall's knowledge of Te Reo Māori. He was the only one of the missionaries who could really speak it fluently. And while John King and William Hall despised Thomas Kendall for his high and mighty attitude, basically all the missionaries accepted that trading muskets for food and protection was their only way forward.
It was something you needed to do if you were going to get on with the natives. You got to have a few muskets to trade. It's like, it wasn't that heinous.
But Samuel Marsden? He did think this was all pretty heinous.
No arguments which you or any other can use will ever convince me but that this is a great sin in the sight of God, and scandal to the Christian name.
There are letters flying back and forth with accusations and counter-accusations about all this, and so much so that in August 1819, Samuel Marsden sailed to Rangihoa to sort this all out face to face. He basically forced any settlers who wanted to stay at Rangihoa to sign an agreement saying they would stop selling muskets. But that promise was pretty much instantly broken because, as Peter Lynham explains, Hongi Hika just wouldn't accept anything else in payment.
This becomes the downfall of the missionaries because he uses it as the fundamental demand. If you want to stay, you have to provide me with muskets.
Meanwhile, as Thomas Kendall was developing his relationship with Hongi Hika and with Māori in general, he was also becoming increasingly isolated from his fellow Europeans, including his wife. By 1816, Thomas and Jane's marriage had collapsed. Jane formed a relationship with a ship captain, Richard Stockwell, and gave birth to his child. Increasingly, Thomas Kendall was spending more and more time among Māori, preferring their company to that of his fellow Europeans.
He sunk into deep depression. I mean, they all came out together with the same mind, and all of a sudden you find yourself isolated, and he would have been very, very lonely. And it's not in the nature of people to stay in that way. So he found solace in our communities, and in doing so, found solace in our ways and our woman, I suppose.
We'll be getting into that whole debacle in our next episode. But keep in mind that in all this time they've been in New Zealand, that's 6 years, the missionaries had not made a single conversion. And as historian Dame Judith Binney wrote in 1968, that failure to save souls would have weighed pretty heavily on Thomas Kendall.
The Calvinist faith created a strong awareness of the existence of sin, and this, combined with a permanent sense of unworthiness, sustained the intense consciousness of personal guilt. But guilt could be quickly translated into its antithesis, a self-righteousness that could not, for a moment, be shaken.
And partly, it was that self-righteousness which drove Thomas Kendall to leave Rangihoa in 1820. Back in 1819, Kendall had requested permission to sail for England. He wanted to work with a linguist to write and publish a full dictionary and grammar of Te Reo Māori. but permission was refused and Kendall was furious. Samuel Marsden arrived at Rangihoa again in February 1820 and tried to convince Kendall to stay, but, as Marsden wrote in a letter, he failed.
Nothing but violence would have retained him in New Zealand at that time, which I had neither authority nor inclination to exercise.
On March 2nd, 1820, Thomas Kendall left Jane and his children in Rangihoa and set sail for London with Hongihika and another Ngāpuhi chief, Waikato. In a letter to Samuel Marsden explaining his actions, he said this:
I can do no good without books, and these ought to be inspected and printed in England. A school can never be carried on without books. I can say no more at present, but remain, Reverend and dear Sir, your very faithful servant, Thomas Kendall.
Then, shortly after Kendall had gone, Samuel Marsden was already annoyed at Thomas Kendall for leaving against his instructions, but after this incident with the muskets and the broken barrel, he was absolutely apoplectic. In his letter to Kendall, he said,
This barter has been the cause of all the evils that have existed amongst you. It incited avarice and jealousies and murmurs and suspicion and neglect of all your proper duties, and turned you aside from the right way, laid you open to the attacks of your enemies, covered your warmest friends with shame, and caused them to weep in secret. No plea can justify such a crime in the sight of God.
You might be wondering how Kendall responded to all of that. Well, it's a battle of words that goes on for years, even after Kendall returned to New Zealand. Maybe his most comprehensive attempt at justification was a letter he sent to Marsden in February 1822. It started like this.
Dear Sir, I freely agree with you in the opinion that the evangelization of the New Zealanders will not be accomplished by carnal weapons. War and bloodshed are also much to be deplored, and will be so by every pious Christian, wherever such evil exists in every part of the earth. Was I a Quaker, I should also say that it is an unchristian profession, that of a gunsmith, and that bartering for muskets or selling them anywhere is incompatible with the principles of Christian religion. But we are fallen men, living in a fallen world.
Those two phrases, by the way, fallen men and fallen world, are both underlined for emphasis. He goes on.
Weapons of war being almost the only medium of exchange at present between Englishmen and New Zealanders, it therefore must be desirable to dispose of such weapons as are of a merciful nature.
You might be wondering what Kendall meant by merciful weapons. Well, apparently he meant more merciful than the other weapons missionaries were selling.
Small hatchets sold so well amongst the natives. Now these hatchets are, all of them, used by natives as weapons of war. We, all of us, know it to be a fact. You know it to be a fact yourself. But as these hatchets are not used as weapons of war by the English, I suppose it was on that very account that the cries of the innocent children whose parents had been butchered by them did not occur to you. There may be men in the world who could view with pleasure a human body cut up with a hatchet in preference to being dispatched with a musket ball, but not, Mr. Marsden, I.
Now, to me, getting cut up with a hatchet and shot with a musket both sound pretty terrible. And Kendall is missing the bigger picture, or maybe deliberately ignoring it. Metal hatchets had a significant impact on Māori warfare, but muskets were a game changer. Historians debate a bit about this. Some will say that the introduction of potatoes as an easily grown, easily stored source of food was an equally decisive factor, and that the impact of firearms is overstated. But the fact remains that after Hongi Hika returned from England with the hundreds of muskets he had acquired during this voyage, he and his allies would launch by far the largest campaigns of the musket wars, escalating the conflicts to a whole new level. Thousands were killed and thousands more were captured and forced to work on plantations, producing food and flax fibre to exchange for yet more weapons. And at least in the eyes of Samuel Marsden, it was the missionaries' trade in muskets which enabled all of this. As he wrote to the missionary leadership in 1821,
Mr. Kendall contended muskets were civilised weapons. I readily admit the force of his argument, provided he could arm all the population of New Zealand with muskets and give all an equal chance of protection. The unarmed natives complained everywhere to me of the injustice of the missionaries in putting muskets into the hands of their enemies to slay them.
in spite of those complaints, Thomas Kendall and some other missionaries continued selling guns to Māori. The choice, as they saw it, was pretty simple. They could sell muskets and keep trying to convert Māori, saving them from internal damnation in their minds, or they could admit defeat and leave, and Māori would probably get the guns anyway. Ultimately, they couldn't bring themselves to leave, and that came with enormous consequences. When Thomas Kendall arrived back in the Bay of Islands from his voyage to England with Hongi Hika and Waikato, he was wearing a newly won clerical collar and holding his completed dictionary of Te Reo Māori. But the ship he landed on was also filled with hundreds of muskets.
It gives Ngāpuhi in general, and Hongi Hika in particular, a massive advantage and leads to the great invasions.
In our next episode, we'll be explaining how all that happened.
It may have been Kendall that helped Hongi organise the muskets he got made in Sydney, perhaps.
And how Thomas Kendall's connection with the Māori world ultimately led to his downfall.
The other missionaries, they really turned on you, particularly if you broke the code.
The moment the first hint of adultery comes about, the British CMS office decides that he must be expelled and he must be removed.
That's all coming next episode. Mā te wā. Black Sheep is written and produced by me, William Ray. Our sound engineers are Phil Benge and William Saunders. Our production coordinator is Brianna Uritich, and the executive producer is Tim Watkin. Voice acting this episode by James Kane, Duncan Smith and Megan Whelan. Be sure to follow Black Sheep wherever you find your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.